It's 6 o'clock. The latest BBC Radio Norfolk news is with Graham Barnard.
A woman from the Dereham area has only just been diagnosed with hepatitis C after catching it following health service errors in the 1980s. Michelle Tolley was given the dirty blood in a transfusion after giving birth. In the year 2000, she was diagnosed with diabetes and thought that other health conditions were related to that rather than hepatitis C. Now she's calling for a campaign to screen anyone who might be affected. She says it's hard to live with.
I'm absolutely furious that I've lost so much of my life through being ill through someone else's fault and mistakes. I'd also want to know where that blood went.
And there's much more from Michelle on The Breakfast Show with Nick Conrad starting in half an hour.
Nick Conrad is on the way in about 6 or so minutes' time. He is going to be talking his big story this morning about the woman in Norfolk who says she's discovered she has hepatitis C after a blood transfusion 30 years ago, all because of contaminated blood imported from America. More on that story with Nick. That's our top story on Breakfast this morning.
6:30, welcome to the programme. This is Nick Conrad with Norfolk's biggest listen at breakfast. Here we go.
For all you need to know at breakfast, Nick Conrad on BBC Radio Norfolk.
Your top story right now. What would you do if you found out that you had contracted hepatitis C from a blood transfusion 30 years ago? Michelle Tolley, who lives in Dereham, has only recently found out that she has the disease, and she's fuming. She says that she had contaminated blood transfusions in the 1980s and 90s following childbirth, and has a quality of life that she claims is now zero. In the programme this morning, we find out what and hasn't been done by the authorities to address this problem. Michelle says that she wants answers and she wants a campaign to get underway to make other people aware.
I got hepatitis C in 1987 or 1991 when I was given dirty blood after giving birth to my children. It's actually taken 28 years for this to come to surface, and questions need to be raised why this was given out, even though when they knew there was a new virus about, why did they still keep using the bloods?
Hear more of Michelle's fascinating yet heartbreaking story later in the programme. I'll also be talking to the group Tainted Blood, who campaign on behalf of haemophiliacs, and I'll also be talking to the Norwich North MP Chloe Smith, who's a member of the all-party parliamentary group on haemophilia and contaminated blood. 01603 617 321 if you want to pick up the phone this morning. Maybe you had a blood transfusion in the 80s and 90s and want to share your experiences on the show. 6:39, this is Nick Conrad at breakfast on BBC Radio Norfolk. Good to have you on the show. Let's have a look at our top story this morning. And it's one that came to our attention via a correspondence from a listener on Facebook. We're going to be hearing the story of Michelle Tolley from Dereham. She recently found out that she has hepatitis C nearly 30 years after a blood transfusion during childbirth. She says that she was numbed and couldn't face her family at first when she found out the news, but then realised the great injustice that had been done.
I got hepatitis C in 1987 or 1991 when I was given dirty blood after giving birth to my children. It's actually taken 28 years for this to come to surface, and questions need to be raised why this was given out, even though when they knew there was a new virus about, why did they still keep using the bloods?
Right, we're going to hear more from Michelle after 7 o'clock. The infected blood scandal has led to an inquiry, apologies from Downing Street, and pledges of millions of pounds for victims. But there have been no sign of that as yet. A large group of people affected by this contaminated blood are now haemophiliacs, and high doses of highly concentrated blood products from hundreds of infected donors has managed to find its way into lots of individuals across the United Kingdom who had transfusions. On the line now is Andy Evans from the pressure group Tainted Blood, which has been campaigning for justice. Very good morning to you. Andy, when did the problem start to surface?
It was, we've traced all of the infected blood round for the haemophiliacs down to about 1982, 1983. But of course, nobody really knew about those infections until a couple of years later. It was discussed at the time that a lot of us have got together, and we've been able to find out that the clinicians actually knew about these infections around about 1985, but nobody was really told until towards the end of the 1980s.
That's the key bit. So what you're alleging is the fact that the problem was known, but blood was still administered.
Yes, that's right. Yes, it was. In fact, as early as the 1960s, the late 1960s, warnings were given from senior clinicians in the United States that blood that was being drawn from dodgy sources, such as prisoners, prostitutes, people who were being paid for their blood donations, who were, I guess you'd call them down and outs, who needed the money, but were at high risk of having contamination, such as hepatitis C, HIV and AIDS. They were paid to donate their blood, and that was getting into the blood supply, especially through the haemophiliacs, where blood donations were all pooled together. So one single contaminated donation would infect an entire batch, which would be given to thousands of haemophiliacs. And of course, once that's happened and, the blood's been shipped out, there's no stopping it then, which is why we have such a massive problem with haemophilia in particular across the world at the moment.
What impact has it had on the health of people that you're campaigning for?
Well, it's been significant. In this country, we've had a total number of infections of around about 4,500 people. Out of those, 1,200 plus were infected with HIV and AIDS, as well as hepatitis C. And of that number, of that 1,200, we have about 280 people left alive now. So it's decimated the population.
What do you want done?
What we need to happen is similar to what's happened in other countries. So we're talking about inquiries which are accountable. So people who were around making the decisions at the time need to be called up in front of somebody who has some legal power to answer the questions as to why this actually happened. All the information's out there. We know it could have been prevented. In France, people were locked up because of this. Around the world, compensation packages have been very generous. But in this country, there's been denial after denial after denial. Nobody wants to take responsibility. And as a result, everybody that's affected has been left without compensation. Some people in extreme poverty, which of course doesn't help with their health needs, and we're very much left out in the cold here.
Thank you for that. Really good to have you on the programme this morning. Andy Evans from the pressure group Tainted Blood. In an hour's time, I'm going to be speaking to a long-distance lorry driver from Diss who was given contaminated blood products for his haemophilia. And last year he needed a liver transplant, but his problems aren't over. His name is Steve Sillett, and he's on the programme at 7:30 this morning. Michelle Tolley, who got in contact with this programme, she is going to be on the programme as well. One of the problems, the big problems, is the fact that people who are given this blood are now haemophiliacs, but there's a whole host of other issues as well that people face, and I think Michelle brilliantly illustrates that in her very frank and incredibly angry interview with this programme this morning. It is must-listen-to radio, and you'll hear it here at 7 o'clock. On 01603 617 321, I'd like you on the programme. If you want to talk to me this morning about the experience that you've had, maybe you have had a blood transfusion in the 80s or the 90s, and you are concerned by the story that we are bringing you this morning. 01603 617 321 if you want to join us. It's coming up to 7 o'clock on BBC Radio Norfolk. This is Nick Conrad with your biggest listen at breakfast.
Norfolk News, Norfolk Life.
This is BBC Radio Norfolk.
Good morning, it's Thursday, the 24th of March 2016. Your top story right now. A woman in Norfolk says that she's discovered that she has hepatitis C after a blood transfusion 30 years ago, all because of contaminated blood imported from America.
We need a campaign. We need to get people who have had transfusions tested, and we need to get them tested soon.
A woman from Norfolk has only just been diagnosed with hepatitis C, despite being infected because of NHS failings in the 1980s. Michelle Tolley from Sparham was given dirty blood in a transfusion after giving birth, but only found out at the end of last year. She saw a GP in the 90s, but was told not to worry. She's now calling for a campaign to get everyone checked who might be affected. Michelle says the disease has had a huge impact on her life.
I've ended up having gallstones, and I'm waiting to have a gallbladder removed, gastritis, a disease of the esophagus, and this is all related to hepatitis C. I've also got stage 4 fibrosis, which possibly indicates cirrhosis now.
A woman in Durham says the government needs to launch a campaign to help victims of dirty blood transfusions. Michelle Tolley has only recently found out that she has hepatitis C after a blood transfusion in the 1980s following childbirth. Little did she know at that point that 30 years down the line she'd be saying the quality of her life is now zero. I've been speaking to Michelle in a very powerful interview that I conducted with her yesterday. Here's what she had to say.
I got hepatitis C in 1987 or 1991 when I was given dirty blood by the blood banks after giving birth to my children. It's actually taken 28 years for this to come to surface, and questions need to be raised why this was given out, even though when they knew there was a new virus about, why did they still keep using the bloods? I'm absolutely furious that I've lost so much of my life through being ill through someone else's fault and mistakes. I'd also want to know where that blood went.
When did you realise something was wrong?
I was diagnosed with diabetes 2 in about the year 2000. So I've always been exceptionally tired, headachy, tummy pains, but everything kind of you relate back to, well, you're diabetic, there you go. In the early 90s, there were adverts on the television regarding hepatitis C, and if you'd had blood transfusions, to contact this telephone number. There was no Google at the time, so everything was by telephone. So I phoned up and got the information. Some magazines come through. I then went along to my GP at the time in Clacton in Essex, spoke to him about it, and he kind of picked the carpet up, brushed it underneath, poo-pooed me off, and no dear, don't be silly, you won't have that. It's been an emotional roller coaster, real emotional.
Just tell me, that moment that you were told that you had hepatitis C, what was your reaction?
Numb. I cried. Shock. I put the phone down from my doctor. I ended up in an emotional heap, sobbing on the floor. Very, very numb and very introvert. I wouldn't speak to my children. I then got very, very angry. And I mean really, really angry. I mean, how dare they give people dirty blood? The blood that came from America, from prisoners and from prostitutes. This is what was being put into our systems.
Hang on, so this blood was being imported into the UK?
Yep, apparently so. It was coming in. That's what allegedly they say. The prisoners and prostitutes were paid to donate blood. No checks were done on the blood. Come over to us, obviously other countries as well, and this is what's happened.
How has it affected your health?
Well, quality of life at the moment is zero. I have none. Sadly to say, I'm going to be medically retired from my job because I can't actually give them a date when I can go back. Although they've been fantastic and very supportive, I've ended up having gallstones, and I'm waiting to have a gallbladder removed. I have gastritis. I have a disease of the esophagus, and this is all related to hepatitis C. I've also got stage 4 fibrosis, which possibly indicates cirrhosis now.
Over the years, a lot of people have found out that they've got hepatitis because of blood transfusions, but you've only recently found out.
Yes.
Do you think that something needs to be done to raise awareness of this problem?
Yes, it does. I mean, if they put those adverts out in the early 90s, Why are they not doing it again now? Why isn't it in the newspapers? They bleat on about this, they bleat on about that. No, it's time. It's got to stop. And people need to be made aware and educated. There isn't a stigma against having hepatitis C. There isn't one.
But do you feel that there's a stigma? Because a lot of people relate hepatitis to a sexually transmitted infection.
Actually, it's a bloodborne. It's a bloodborne virus. There's 1% chance of it being sexually transmitted.
But, I mean, you're spot on, but you know that people very often say hepatitis, it must be an STI.
Oh, yeah, an STI, or that you're a drug user. And I haven't been a drug user, and I've been married for nearly 32 years. So...
It's okay.
It's gone, see, brain fog.
But that's interesting, because you say that because this condition, every now and again, you cloud over, you fog over.
Yeah.
And you're clearly very, very emotional talking about this,
yes.
And quite understandably so. How do you feel you've been treated by the authorities over this?
The actual hospital that I'm dealing with, which is the NNU, have been very good. And I can't fault them at all. For the actual, back in the late 80s, early 90s, when I was pregnant with my second child, I had 2 letters come through. 1 to tell me I had gestational diabetes, and 2 that I had antibodies in my blood, and I'd given a little card that if I needed blood transfusions in the future, that my bloods were meant to be carefully cross-matched. Now, I needed a second lot of transfusions in 1991 when my twins were born. So now, they already knew about this in 1989, but bloods were still being given out. So if they already knew, why wasn't I tested then?
Why did you get in contact with the programme?
Well, I got in contact with your programme. I've listened to you for years, and I know you like to fight for people who are suffering. I'd like, with your dementia calls, you have a passion and you like to get people to know what's actually going on, what's going out there, and what people are actually going through. We need a campaign. We need to get people who have had transfusions tested, and we need to get them tested soon.
That's Michelle Tolley, who I spoke to yesterday. Brian's called the programme. Good morning, Brian.
Good morning.
Good morning, you're on air. Tell me, what happened to you?
I've got hepatitis B. I've had it since birth because I got it from my mother who died from it.
What's it like living with hepatitis B?
Well, you just have to, and that's all there is to it. There's lots of spin-offs with your health and that, but I'm with the NNE, the Norfolk and Norwich Hospital, and the treatment and the way I'm treated there is excellent. It couldn't be better. You've still got to get on and just sort of soldier on.
Sorry, Brian, for talking across you. What are the side effects? What kind of symptoms do you live with?
Tiredness is, you get extremely tired at all times in the day, and your liver is responsible for in excess of 500 body functions. So if it's under attack, which it is constantly, then some of those things are going to come to the fore. I've got peripheral neuropathy, which means you sort of gradually lose the feeling in your feet and that. But what it is, I think the lady before me said there isn't a stigma with hepatitis. Well, there is. Every now and again, the government, they put out on the radio that, and I think it's there, they have to because of the WHO, with regards to hepatitis B and C. And they start off by saying, if you've had gay sex, if you've done drugs, if you've had needles, etc., etc. Now, 99.9% of the population don't do that, and they switch off.
So do you feel that when you say you've got hepatitis B, people just assume that you've partaken in one of those activities?
Well, they're not going to tell you, but I've gone to say, had a friend, I've gone to kiss them cheerio, and they withdraw from you.
I'm sorry to hear.
They're dead scared of it. It's because of ignorance.
Okay. Brian, forgive me, I've got to leave it there, but really good to have you on the programme this morning. Thank you so much for your call. You take care. All the best. Later in the programme, we're going to hear from a man who says he ended up with liver cancer after a transfusion, and I'll be asking the Norwich North MP, Chloe Smith, what has happened to government pledges to compensate people who've ended up with life-threatening illnesses because of imported blood in the 1980s. 24th of March 2016, this is Nick Conrad at Breakfast on BBC Radio Norfolk, 7:32. Graham Barnard's got your headlines.
A woman from Sparham near Norwich is calling for screening for people given dirty blood transfusions in the 1980s. Michelle Tolley has only just been diagnosed with hepatitis C after catching it as a result of health service errors.
For all you need to know at breakfast, Nick Conrad on BBC Radio Norfolk.
Coming up on the show, we're going to be talking more about this story of contaminated blood after Michelle from Dereham got in contact with my programme. She said, I really want to talk on your breakfast show about this issue, which has destroyed my life. I'll be talking to another man from Norfolk whose life has been turned upside down by receiving dirty blood products. This morning we've been hearing from a woman in Dereham, Michelle Tolley, who's been calling for a government campaign to get people tested for hepatitis C if they had blood transfusions in the late 1980s. She's just discovered, 30 years down the line, that she has the disease due to contaminated blood from the USA used by the NHS during the birth of her first child.
If they put those adverts out in the early 90s, why are they not doing it again now? Why isn't it in the newspapers? They bleat on about this, they bleat on about that. No, it's time. It's got to stop. And people need to be made aware and educated. There isn't a stigma against having hepatitis C. There isn't one.
After 8 this morning, we're going to hear from a Norfolk MP looking into the scandal of contaminated blood, something that also affects haemophiliacs with life-changing results. Steve Sillett from DIS is a long-distance lorry driver. He's in Bristol at the moment, but he's pulled over to talk to this programme this morning. Steve, very good morning to you.
Good morning.
Good morning. Thank you for your time. We talked to you last year about your anger at the way that this contaminated blood scandal had been handled. Just summarise for my listeners this morning, what happened to you?
I was diagnosed about 10 years ago with hepatitis C, and it obviously goes through its stages to cirrhosis and then to liver cancer. On the 25th of February 2015, I had a liver transplant. So that's got rid of the hep C and all the rest of it. I'm now left with a liver with a block into my main artery, so I've now got to go through another liver transplant.
Right, and so your doctors say that you're going to have to, this is what's been handed to me by my researcher, wait for it to die and get another transplant if possible, is that right?
Basically, yes. I've got to wait until I get really ill before they'll put me on the transplant list. They won't do it now because at the moment I'm reasonably healthy, so yeah, I've got to wait, play the waiting game again.
But at that point you're going to have to give up your work?
Yes, it was 7 months last time off work with no pay. Because in the haulage business we don't get sick pay, so you're relying on handouts from the government and what have you.
Who do you hold responsible for this?
The government who said yes to importing this blood from America and various other places. I mean, if they hadn't imported this and we'd have maintained the blood supply in Britain, then none of us would have been in this situation.
Before the last election, David Cameron apologised and he promised £25 million to ease the situation. What's happened since then?
Nothing, basically. Haven't seen anything of the 25 million. His apologies sounded to me a little bit hollow, but anyway, apologies are a bit late now, aren't they? Because so many of us have died and so many of us are critically ill. And as you've heard, I've got to go through another liver transplant and another 7 months off work. So, no, they've done nothing, basically.
If somebody was listening in from the Department for Health this morning, what would you say to them directly?
Oh, crikey, I don't think you want to know, really. I'm pretty angry about it because it's 7 months off work. It's savings that we had saved up have all gone. I've now got to go through that and try and save that up now. I'm working like a numpty to try and earn money again to put aside for this 7 months. I'm going to have to go off for the next one. And they're just not doing anything. They just seem to drag their heels and make excuses. And I'm sure a lot of us feel that all they're doing is waiting for the rest of us to die, but then they won't have to compensate anybody then.
So hang on, that's quite a big claim to make. So you're suggesting that the liability, the amount of money that the government will have to pay out will be significantly less as the years tick by because, as will happen to all of us, more and more of us are either naturally dying or we're dying because of conditions related to what is being described as dirty blood.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. That's exactly how most of us feel, I believe, because of the way they treat us.
Chloe Smith, the MP for Norwich North, has been campaigning very hard in this area. She sits on the all-party parliamentary group on haemophilia and contaminated blood. What would you say to her?
They just need to get on with it and sort this out. I mean, this new thing that they're going through now is just another delaying tactic. Everything they do is just pure delay all the time. That's all we seem to get. And now they're crying that they want to do a public inquiry. Well, how many years is that going to take, and how many millions of pounds will that take? We've just had Penrose, 6 years and about £12 million to come out with one silly little suggestion.
If I asked you to sum up your life now in one word, what would you say?
It's nothing like it should be, put it that way. It's virtually wrecked my marriage. It's just destroyed most things in life, really. Can I
ask about that on a personal level? Because actually, forgive me for prying, but I think that's also very important to this story. A lot of people say, I have got these conditions, this is the effect on my life, but then somebody says it's wrecked my marriage. Actually, in many ways, that is equally, if not more powerful. So how has it wrecked your marriage?
Well, if you think about it, my wife has to sit there and watch me go through all this, all the treatment I've had in the last 10 years with the hepatitis. I went through interferon and ribavirin treatment, which was probably the worst 6 months of my life. She had to sit back and watch all that. It's destroyed various things in our marriage. It is just a knock-on effect. It's like putting a pebble in a pond, isn't it? Watching the ripple effect, basically.
Really good to have you on the programme this morning. Thank you so much for your time. I wish you all the best, Steve.
Thank you.
Safe journey on the road this morning.
Thanks very much.
That's
Bye.
Steve Sillett from DIS. As I just mentioned to Steve, I'm going to be talking to the Norwich North MP Chloe Smith after 8 o'clock this morning to find out what the government's doing to look after people who've been given contaminated blood. And if you wish to join us, I've now got a few emails coming in. This is interesting. This is very often how these stories start. We get one or two people coming forward and then more people say, hang on, I've got a problem here. If you wish to get in contact with us, conrad@bbc.co.uk on the email, text 81333, start your message with the word Norfolk, and you can call 01603 617 321. Good morning, you're waking up to Thursday, the 24th of March 2016. This is Nick Conrad at Breakfast. Here come your headlines. A woman from Derham's only just being diagnosed with hepatitis C despite being infected because of an NHS failing in the 1980s. Michelle Tolley is speaking exclusively to this programme this morning. It's coming up to 8 o'clock on BBC Radio Norfolk. This is Nick Conrad with your biggest listen at breakfast.
Norfolk News, Norfolk Life.
This is BBC Radio Norfolk.
Good morning, it's Thursday the 24th of March 2016. Your top story right now, the people in Norfolk who are living with health problems like hepatitis C after being given contaminated blood products in the 1980s. Incredibly powerful radio. More on that story shortly.
A Norfolk woman says she's only just been diagnosed with hepatitis C after catching it following health service errors in the 1980s. Michelle Tolley from Sparham was given the dirty blood in a transfusion after giving birth. In the year 2000, she was diagnosed with diabetes and thought other health conditions were related to that rather than hepatitis C. Now she's calling for a campaign to screen anyone who might be affected. She says it's a hard thing to live with.
I'm absolutely furious that I've lost so much of my life through being ill through someone else's fault and mistakes. I'd also want to know where that blood went.
It is 10 minutes past 8. This is Nick Conrad at Breakfast. You're waking up to Thursday, the 24th of March 2016. Our top story this morning, there are calls for a new awareness campaign after a woman from Derham found out that she had hepatitis C nearly 30 years after a blood transfusion.
I got hepatitis C in 1987 or 1991 when I was given dirty blood by the blood banks after giving birth to my children. It's actually taken 28 years for this to come to surface and, questions need to be raised. Why this was given out, even though when they knew there was a new virus about, why did they still keep using the bloods? I'm absolutely furious that I've lost so much of my life through being ill through someone else's fault and mistakes. I'd also want to know where that blood went. You know, they bleat on about this, they bleat on about that. No, it's time. It's got to stop. And people need to be made aware and educated. We need a campaign. We need to get people who have had transfusions tested. And we need to get them tested soon.
Michelle Tolley contacted my programme because she says the authorities, namely the government and its officials, aren't doing enough to compensate and look after the people whose health has been damaged by so-called dirty blood imported from the States in the 1980s and used on NHS patients. But MPs have been asking questions. There's been a major inquiry in Scotland about the problem, and David Cameron has apologised for the mistakes. Last year, he said the government would provide up to £25 million in 2015-16 to support any transitional arrangements to a better payment system, something the victims say that they've never seen. People like Steve Sillett from Diss, who developed liver cancer and had a transplant after doctors used infected blood products on him for haemophilia. He told me this morning about what it's like living with hepatitis C and how it's changed his life.
I'm pretty angry about it because it's 7 months off work. It's savings that we had saved up have all gone. I've now got to go through that and try and save that up now. I'm working like a numpty to try and earn money again to put aside for this 7 months. I'm going to have to go off for the next one. And they're just not doing anything. They just seem to drag their heels and make excuses. And I'm sure a lot of us feel that all they're doing is waiting for the rest of us to die, but then they won't have to compensate anybody then.
A group of MPs have been looking at these cases. The All-Parliamentary Group on Haemophilia and Contaminated Blood is the name of that group. The Norwich North MP Chloe Smith is a member of that group and has been campaigning on this issue for quite some time. Chloe, very good morning to you.
Good morning.
These are compelling stories. What went wrong in the 1980s and what happened to allow this blood to be used by the NHS?
Well, as I understand it, this was happening over a couple of decades. I believe it has stopped by quite some way. By the way, I ought to say that I think in response to perhaps Michelle's concerns that it could still be continuing. I don't believe any such practice is continuing, and obviously that's very important. I believe what happened was that the NHS had a particular source of blood products for those who needed transfusions. So that might have been somebody who just needed blood in the normal course of an operation. But of course, the people that it really perhaps hit the hardest was those who are what's called haemophiliac, who have a particular problem with blood and the way it works in their body. That blood was taken from a certain source. I believe it was from the US, and the result of that, as Michelle has mentioned, and as I think maybe other people know, is that there were a couple of thousand of people. We believe now that it is likely to be a small number of thousands of people remaining who are in this position, although it's hard to know how many. But those people have been, as you say, very badly affected, and there is a range of quite terrible diseases and infections they've had. This is a national tragedy. It is a tragedy and a scandal, and it is something that we now need to repair as much as we can. Obviously, I choose my words carefully there because, tragically, many people have died from this.
Yeah. David Cameron pledged £25 million to help people like Steve and Michelle who've talked to this programme this morning. I understand that since has been put on hold. Why is that?
What is happening is the government is designing a new scheme for to get money and support to those who are affected. So, fairly enough, you need to design that scheme carefully. Obviously, there are people who are going to be deeply affected by the way that scheme is designed. So you need to take time and get it right. You can't just do that overnight. It's actually not just £25 million. It's £100 million plus the 25, and that is in addition to the money that was already being spent. That is going to be coming about over the next couple of years, in other words, in the spending review period. And actually what that does is, in fact, double what the Department of Health already spent on the scheme over recent times. So this is a very positive move. And what is happening at the moment is that scheme is being designed. There is, in fact, a consultation out at the moment. I really would urge Michelle or anyone else listening to go and have a look at that consultation, because it's still going for another couple of weeks. And it's so important that Michelle's views and those of anybody else who are or have been affected are in that consultation, so that they can get the design of the new scheme right, so that it helps the sufferers most of all.
Yeah, I know you've been campaigning on this, and you've been quite a strong advocate to try and get justice for people who've been affected, and I know now you sit on the All-Parliamentary Group for haemophilia and contaminated blood. A lot of people listening in this morning would say, look, this is a major injustice. You've already called it a scandal. Money's all we can offer them, that we can't do anything else to repair their health. But do you think that there should be quite generous compensation packages for people who've been affected?
Yes, of course I do. And as you say, this is an injustice. This has been an appalling thing to have happened to fellow human beings. And Michelle, rightly, is furious. Of course she should be. This is not her fault. It's not the fault of anybody who received these products those decades ago. And the impacts can be absolutely dreadful. And I've spoken up in Parliament for a couple of my constituents in North Norwich who have been dreadfully affected, and their stories are very powerful and very important to tell, because of course many of them are too ill to be standing up and perhaps fighting this themselves for quite so long. So what we need to do now is get the design of this scheme right. This is a cross-party effort. So the group is the all-party parliamentary group, and that means that we work on a cross-party basis to try to get this right. This is not a party political issue at all. This is just something that needs to be got right. What's happened to date? There is compensation available. Compensation is a difficult word to use. There is funds available, because of course you can't compensate somebody for such a terrible thing happening in their life. I don't think money would get close. But what you can do is give them financial support, and that has been happening to date by means of 5 different organisations that have been made responsible for providing those funds to people upon application. Now, often people feel that those schemes have operated in a fairly piecemeal way. They use complex criteria, and there's a concern that certain sort of aspects of people's experience haven't been met through those. So that's why the reform is needed. And as we've already said, this is also the opportunity to be able to put more funds into that, which is a good thing and the right thing to do. So my hope would be that we can get to a simple scheme that is easy for you to use, and that operates from now as quickly as possible to get help to those who need it, and to their families who very sadly can be left bereaved and, of course, affected in their own right.
Yeah, OK, Chloe, thank you. That's Chloe Smith, the Norwich North MP, who also sits on the All-Party Parliamentary Group on